Mom, starting with your next paycheck, we're transferring all your money to my account. Those were the words my son Bryce spoke to me that Tuesday afternoon while drinking coffee in my kitchen. He said it as if he were proposing something completely normal, as if he were doing me a favor, as if I were incapable of managing my own money at 62 years old. I stared at him. I didn't say anything for a few seconds. I just searched his eyes for an explanation. Why my own son, the boy I raised alone, the man I fed with the sweat of my brow, was asking for total access to my bank account. But I found nothing. I only saw that calm smile, that confidence of a person who knows he's in control. So I took a deep breath and told him yes, that it seemed fine, that I trusted him. Bryce's smile widened. He stood up, gave me a quick mechanical kiss on the forehead, one of those kisses that mean nothing, and told me it was for the best. He said I wouldn't have to worry about a thing, that he'd take care of everything, that it was for my own good. Those words, for my own good, floated in the air long after he left my house. That very evening, like every Friday, Bryce came back, not alone, but with his wife, just as he always did. He arrived expecting me to have dinner ready, the table set, hot and free food waiting for them, as had been the routine every Friday for the past 3 years. I heard them arrive. I heard their footsteps at the entrance. I heard the key I'd given him turning in the lock. I heard the door open, and then I heard the scream. It was a high-pitched, desperate sound. The scream of someone who'd just seen something they never expected to see. The cry of someone realizing things weren't going to be the way they thought. I remained seated in my chair in the empty kitchen, in the empty house, listening to that scream echo against the walls. I didn't move. I didn't go to see what was happening. I already knew what was happening. Bryce rushed into the kitchen. His face was pale, his eyes wide open. His wife followed him with the same expression of shock and disbelief. "Mom!" Bryce yelled. "Mom, what did you do? Where is everything? Where's the furniture? Where's the TV? Where is everything that was here?" I looked at him calmly, with a self-possession I didn't know I had. I told him, in the softest voice I could find, that I had sold a few things, that I needed the cash. After all, if he was going to handle my finances, I needed to make sure I had some money on hand first. His face changed from pale to red with pure fury. He took a step toward me, and for the first time in my life, I saw my son for what he truly was. Not the boy I had raised, not the young man I had helped build his life, but a stranger. Someone who looked at me with contempt, with rage, with something that dangerously resembled hate. "You're crazy," he snapped. "You are completely out of your mind. How could you sell things without consulting me now? How are we supposed to watch TV when we come over? How are we going to be comfortable here?" That last sentence changed everything. How are we going to be comfortable here? Not, how are you going to be comfortable, Mom? He wasn't worried about how this affected me, but how they would be comfortable, as if my house were an extension of theirs, as if my possessions existed for their convenience. His wife stepped closer. She looked at me with those eyes that always seemed cold and calculating and said something I will never forget. She said I was being selfish, that I was only thinking about myself, that they came every week to keep me company, to make sure I was doing well, and this was how they repaid me? Selfish? Me, the woman who had worked double shifts for years so Bryce could go to college, the woman who had given up on rebuilding her life after his father abandoned us because she didn't want her son to grow up with a stepfather. The woman who had lived in small apartments, worn old clothes, and ate the bare minimum so he could have everything he needed. Selfish. Bryce stood there, looking at me as if I were a problem he needed to solve. And then he said something that broke me in two. He said, maybe it had been a mistake to propose the bank account transfer, that maybe I wasn't in any condition to make good decisions, that perhaps I needed more help than he thought. More help. As if I were a burden, an elderly woman who needed to be controlled. I stood up from my chair. I looked at both of them and told them in a voice that came out louder than I expected that dinner was not ready, that there was no dinner, and that if they were hungry, they could go eat somewhere else. The silence that followed was thick, heavy. Bryce stared at me as if he couldn't believe what he just heard. His wife let out a dry, bitter laugh and mumbled something about respect and gratitude, and then Bryce spoke the final line, the one I still hear in my head when I close my eyes at night. He said with a coldness I'd never known him to possess that I should be careful. A woman my age, alone, without family who truly cared about her, could end up in a bad way. He said I was the only thing he had, and I should remember that before doing anything stupid. They left. They stormed out of my house, slamming doors, leaving a trail of rage and veiled threats. I heard them get into the car, heard the engine start, and listened as they drove away. I stood there in my empty kitchen, in my empty house, feeling something inside me permanently shatter. But it wasn't sadness I felt. It wasn't desperation. It was something different. It was clarity. It was the absolute certainty that my son didn't love me, that perhaps he never had, that I was just a resource to him, a source of money, food, and convenience. I sat back down in my chair. I looked at the bare walls of my living room. I looked at the empty spaces where furniture I'd bought with my labor and effort once stood. And for the first time in a very long time, I smiled. Because Bryce didn't know something. He didn't know I hadn't sold the furniture for money. I had sold it to send a message, to see how he would react, to confirm what I already suspected deep down in my heart. And he had reacted exactly as I expected, with rage, with indignation, with the attitude of someone who feels entitled to another person's things. That night, as I sat in the darkness of my empty house, I made a decision. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to do something much more powerful. I was going to observe. I was going to wait. I was going to let Bryce believe he had won. And then when he least expected it, when he was most confident, most sure of his control over me, I was going to show him who Eleanor Ellie Johnson truly was. Not the submissive mother he thought he knew, but the woman who had survived a broken marriage, poverty, and grueling hard work. The woman who knew exactly how to protect herself. The woman he should never have underestimated. There was a time I believed being a mother was enough. That the love I gave would be naturally returned, as if it were a universal law that the sacrifices I made every day would build something solid, something unbreakable between me and my son. How wrong I was. Bryce was born on a stormy night 34 years ago. His father, the man who had promised me a life together, left when the boy was barely 2. He said he wasn't ready to be a dad, that he needed to find himself, and that I would understand someday. I never understood, but I also didn't wait for him to return. I was left alone with a small child, a 2-bedroom apartment I could barely afford, and a secretary job that paid $800 a month. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. So I got a second job, cleaning offices at night. I would leave Bryce with my neighbor, Mrs. Bertha Washington, an older lady who charged me $50 a week to watch him. I worked from 7 in the morning until 6 in the evening at the office. I'd come home, feed Bryce, bathe him, put him to bed, and then head out again at 9 at night to clean buildings until 2 in the morning. I slept 4 hours and started all over again. I did this for years, so many years that I lost count. I remember Bryce always wanted the brand dime sneakers the other kids at school wore. They cost $100. I earned maybe $1,200 a month between both jobs. $100 was almost all the money I had for groceries for 2 weeks. But I bought them for him. I didn't want my son to feel less than anyone else. I wanted him to know his mother would do anything for him. I ate rice and beans for an entire month to pay for those sneakers. When Bryce turned 18, he wanted to go to a private college that cost $10,000 a year. I didn't have that money. I didn't even have a tenth of that money. But I went to the bank
and took out a loan. I went into debt for 4 full years of education, which I ended up paying off over 10 years. 10 years of paying a loan so my son could have a college degree. He graduated, got a good job. He earned $6,000 a month, double what I made after 30 years of working. And I was happy. I thought he could finally build his life. I thought I had finally done my job as a mother well. But Bryce didn't move out right away. He said he wanted to save money, that he wanted to have a solid base before becoming independent. I told him, of course, this is your home. You can stay as long as you need. He stayed 5 more years. 5 years where I kept working both my jobs. 5 years where I paid the rent, bought the food, and covered the utilities. 5 years where Bryce saved every single penny of his salary because he didn't have to pay for anything. When he finally left, it wasn't to rent an apartment. It was to buy a house. A $300,000 house that he paid for in cash because he had saved all his money during those 5 years of living for free in my home. I was proud. I told him I was proud, and I was. I thought I had done well to help him. I thought that now that he had his own house, maybe he could help me. Maybe I could work less. Maybe I could rest a little. But that never happened. Bryce got married 2 years after moving out. His wife was an elegant woman, one of those who always dressed well, always had perfect nails, and always spoke in a tone that sounded polite, but hid a certain coldness. I noticed from the start that she looked at me differently, as if I were somehow inferior, as if she didn't understand why Bryce came from where he came from. At the wedding, which cost $30,000, I sat at a back table, not at the head table with the family. Bryce explained it was because there were a lot of important people, clients from his work, and they needed those tables for them. I said I understood. I smiled in the photos, danced when asked, and went home alone that night, feeling strangely empty. After the wedding, Bryce's visits became less frequent. Before, he came to see me 2 or 3 times a week. After he got married, he came once every 2 weeks, then once a month, always in a rush, always looking at his phone, always with some excuse to leave early. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be the heavy mother, the complaining mother, the mother who didn't understand her son had his own life now. But then they started coming on Friday nights, always around dinner time, always unannounced, always expecting me to have food ready. At first, I was delighted. I thought Bryce finally wanted to spend time with me, that he finally missed me. So I cooked his favorite dishes, set the table nicely, bought dessert. But I noticed something. I noticed Bryce never came alone. He always brought his wife. And I noticed they never came to chat. They came to eat. They arrived, sat down, ate, and left. Sometimes they stayed an hour, sometimes less. I also noticed he never brought anything. Never a bottle of wine, never a dessert, never money to help with the food. Nothing. One night after they left, I calculated how much I had spent on the dinner. $15. Money I didn't have to spare. $15 meant I would have to work extra hours to compensate. And I realized something. I realized that for Bryce, I had become a service, a free restaurant, a place where he could come to eat without paying, without even truly saying thank you. I began to notice other things too. I noticed that when I asked him for help with something, he always had an excuse. When I needed him to take me to the doctor because my car was broken, he was always too busy. When I mentioned my refrigerator was making strange noises and I was afraid it would break soon, he told me to buy a new one, as if I had $500 saved for emergencies. I didn't. I barely had enough to make it to the end of the month. But the worst was my birthday, my 60th birthday. Bryce arrived 2 hours late with no gift, no card, and an excuse about traffic. He stayed 20 minutes. He ate the cake I had bought for myself because I didn't want to spend the day alone. And then he left. I cried that night. I cried like I hadn't cried in years because I finally understood something I had been denying for too long. I understood that to my son, I was no longer important. I was just a resource, something that was there, available, waiting to be used when he needed me. And the worst part was that I had allowed it. I had set that pattern. I had never asked him for anything. I had never told him I felt used. I had never told him I needed more from him than just 20-minute visits and Friday night dinners. I was afraid. Afraid that if I complained, if I asked, if I demanded, he would disappear completely. And the idea of losing my son, even this son who barely saw me, terrified me more than anything else. So I continued being the convenient mother, the silent mother, the mother who was always there, who always had the door open, who never caused trouble. Until that Thursday afternoon, until Bryce told me he wanted to manage my money. Something inside me, something that had been dormant for years, woke up. A small but clear voice that told me this wasn't right, that this was the beginning of something I wouldn't be able to reverse once it started. But even then, even with that voice whispering in my head, I told him yes, because I still had hope. I still wanted to believe my son loved me, that he would protect me, that he would do the right thing. How foolish I was. The following Monday, Bryce came to my house with papers, lots of papers. He spread them out on the kitchen table with that smile that now seemed different, less warm, more calculated. "Mom, this is simple," he said. "I just need you to sign here, here, and here. These are the documents so I can have access to your account, so I can automatically transfer your salary every month. That way, I'll take care of paying your bills, managing everything. You won't have to worry about a thing." I looked at the papers. They were bank forms, authorization forms. I read the fine print, the parts people usually ignore, and I saw something that chilled my blood. It wasn't just access to my account. It was full power of attorney. It was the authority to make transfers, to close accounts, to make financial decisions on my behalf. "Bryce, this says you'd have total control over my money," I told him. He nodded as if it was the most normal thing in the world. "Yes, Mom, it's easier that way. That way I can handle everything without having to ask you for authorization every time. It's for practicality." Practicality. That word echoed in my head. Practicality for whom? I wondered, but I didn't say it out loud. I took the pen he offered me. I held it in my hand, and for a moment I was about to sign. I was about to give him everything because that's what I had always done. Trust, surrender, believe. But then I remembered Friday night. I remembered his face contorted in fury when he saw the empty house. I remembered his words. I remembered how he had threatened me, even though he probably didn't even realize it was a threat. I put the pen down on the table. "You know what, Bryce? Give me a few days to think about it. I want to read everything calmly. I want to be sure. His expression changed for just a second. A flash of irritation crossed his face before he smiled again. Mom, there's nothing to think about. It's simple. But okay, if you want to take a few days, that's fine. He left then, but he left the papers, as if assuming I would eventually sign them anyway. I couldn't sleep that night. I stayed up looking at those papers on the kitchen table, and something inside me told me this was not for my good, that this was the beginning of something I wouldn't be able to reverse once it started. The next day, I went to the bank. I went early before my job. I asked the teller to review my account, to show me all the transactions for the last 6 months. She printed the papers. They were several pages long. I reviewed them carefully, line by line, and then I saw it. I saw it, and I felt the floor move beneath my feet. There was a withdrawal I hadn't made, a withdrawal of $1,200 from 3 months ago. $1,200 that had left my account and I didn't remember taking it out. I asked the teller if she could see more details. She checked her computer and told me something that took my breath away. She said the withdrawal had been made at a branch across town using my debit card. But I had never gone to that branch, and my card was in my wallet. It had always been in my wallet, except for once. I remembered then. I remembered that 3 months ago, Bryce had come to visit. I was in the shower when he arrived. I yelled for him to come in, that the door was open. When I came out, he was waiting for me in the living room. We sat down to chat, and at some point, I went to the kitchen to make coffee. My wallet was in my purse. My purse was in the living room with Bryce. I felt nauseated. I felt the whole world tilting strangely because this could only mean one thing. It meant my son had taken my card, memorized or photographed the numbers, and withdrawn money from my account without my permission. I asked the teller if there was any way to know exactly what had happened with that withdrawal. She told me I needed to file a formal claim, that the bank would investigate, which could take several weeks. I told her I'd think about it, and I left the bank feeling like I no longer knew my own son. But I didn't file the claim, not yet, because I needed to be sure. I needed to know if this had been just once or if there was more. I spent the next few days checking everything, every piece of paper I had in my house, every document, every old bank statement I had kept in a box in my closet, and I found more things. I found that 2 years ago, when I was in the hospital with pneumonia, someone had used my health insurance for consultations I hadn't made, appointments at clinics I didn't know, consultations that had exhausted my annual coverage, which was why I had had to pay out of pocket for some medications that year. I also found a credit card in my name that I didn't remember applying for, a card with a balance of $3,000. $3,000 in purchases I hadn't made at stores I'd never been to. I called the credit card bank. I asked them when the account had been opened. They told me 18 months ago. I asked if they could tell me where the purchases had been made. They gave me a list. Hardware stores, electronic shops, home furnishing stores. Bryce had bought a house 2 years ago. Bryce had renovated that house, and apparently Bryce had used my credit to do it. I sat on the floor of my room, surrounded by papers, feeling everything I had believed about my life crumble. It wasn't just the money. It was the betrayal. It was knowing my son had been robbing me for years, that he had viewed me as an unlimited resource, that he had never intended to care for or protect me. I cried until I had no tears left. Then I wiped my face, gathered all the papers, and made a decision. I wasn't going to confront him yet. I wasn't going to yell or accuse him because I knew if I did, he would deny everything. He'd say I was confused. He'd say I was senile. He'd say anything to make me doubt my own memory, my own sanity. No, I was going to be smarter than that. I was going to gather evidence. I was going to document everything. I was going to build a case so solid he couldn't deny it. And then, only then, would I act. On Friday of that week, Bryce came back, as always, at dinner time, as always, expecting me to have food ready. But this time, I had cooked differently. I had made his favorite dish, chicken and rice. The same meal I used to make when he was a boy and came home sad from school. The dish that told him how much I loved him without needing words. He sat at the table with his wife. They ate. They talked about superficial things. Work, the weather, the new movie they wanted to see. I watched them. I watched them as if I were seeing them for the first time and realized something. I realized Bryce ate my food with the same indifference he would eat fast food. There was no gratitude in his eyes, no love, just the mechanical act of eating something free. When they finished, Bryce pulled out the bank papers again. He placed them on the table, right next to his empty plate. "Mom, the days you asked for are up. You've thought about it, right? Sign this and I'll take care of everything." I looked him straight in the eyes and told him in the calmest voice I could find that I still wasn't sure, that I needed more time. His wife scoffed. "Ellie, this is ridiculous. Bryce is just trying to help you. I don't understand why you're so distrustful." Distrustful? She called me distrustful. And the saddest part was she was right, but not in the way she thought. Bryce stood up. His expression was hard now without the mask of a smile. "Mom, this is for your own good. You can't keep managing your finances alone. It's obvious. Look how you sold the furniture without thinking. Look at the irrational decisions you're making." Irrational. Selling my own furniture in my own house was irrational, but robbing me for years wasn't? I didn't say anything. I just held his gaze until he looked away. They left that night without saying goodbye, and I stayed seated in my kitchen, staring at those unsigned papers, knowing the war was just beginning. A silent war. A war I had to win, because if I lost it, I wouldn't just lose my money. I would lose my dignity, my autonomy, my life. The days after that dinner grew strange. Bryce didn't call again. He didn't visit again. It was as if he had decided to punish me with his absence, as if he believed I would break down without him, that I would beg him to return, that I would finally sign those papers just to get his attention back. But I didn't break down. For the first time in years, the silence of my house didn't feel empty. It felt full of something different. It felt full of clarity. I spent those days reviewing every detail of my financial life, every receipt I had saved, every bank statement I had kept in a box in my closet, and I found more things. I found that 3 years ago, when Bryce asked to borrow my ID because he had lost it and needed to pick up an urgent package, he had done something more with it. He had opened a utility account in my name at an address that wasn't mine, his house. For 3 years, the electricity bill for Bryce's house had been in my name, and when he didn't pay on time, the penalties piled up on my credit score. That was why I had been denied a small loan last year when my car needed urgent repairs. That was why my credit score had mysteriously dropped. I called the utility company. I explained that the account was mine, that I had never lived at that address. The woman on the phone told me I needed to file an affidavit, that I had to report this as identity fraud. Identity fraud, committed by my own son. I hung up the phone and stared at the wall for a long time, trying to process how I had reached this point, trying to understand when my son had turned into this. I couldn't sleep that night. I stayed awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city outside, and I thought about all the times I had justified his behavior, All the times I had told myself he was busy, that he had his own life, that I was being demanding by expecting more from him. But this wasn't about expectations. This was about theft, about deception, about a son who viewed his mother as a resource he could exploit without consequence. The next morning, I did something I had never done before. I went to see a lawyer. It was a small office downtown. The sign read, David Chung. I had seen an ad for him in the paper offering free consultations. I walked in feeling small, feeling ridiculous. A woman of 62 coming to complain about her own son. But the receptionist smiled kindly and showed me in. Astra Chung was a man in his 50s with graying temples and kind eyes. He asked me to tell him everything, and I did. I told him about the missing money, the credit card I didn't apply for, the utility account, the papers Bryce wanted me to sign. He listened without interrupting. He took notes in a notepad, and when I finished, he leaned back in his chair and Mrs. Johnson, he said, what you are describing is financial fraud and abuse of trust. If you sign those papers your son is asking for, you are giving him total legal access to your money. He could empty everything and you would have no legal recourse because you gave him permission yourself. The words fell on me like stones. I knew it deep down, I knew it, but hearing it spoken aloud by a professional made it real in a different way. What can I do? I asked. He leaned forward. First, don't sign anything. Second, you need to report the credit card fraud and the theft from your bank account. Third, you need to change all your passwords, your PIN, everything. Fourth, consider getting a restraining order if you feel you are in danger. A restraining order against my own son? The idea seemed absurd and devastating at the same time. I don't want to get him into legal trouble, I said. He's my son. The lawyer looked at me with what looked like compassion and sadness. Mrs. Johnson, your son is already in legal trouble. He's committed several felonies. The question isn't whether you want to get him into trouble. The question is whether you want to protect yourself. I left that office with a folder full of forms and a list of things I needed to do. I felt overwhelmed, but I also felt something else. I felt determination. I went straight to the bank. I changed all my passwords, requested a new debit card, closed the fraudulent credit card, and filed a formal dispute. The teller helped me with everything. She treated me with patience without making me feel stupid or weak. When I arrived home that afternoon, I felt exhausted, but also strangely light, as if an invisible weight I had been carrying for years had been lifted. That night, Bryce finally called. His voice sounded strained on the phone. Mom, we need to talk. Come to my house for dinner tomorrow. We have to resolve this. It wasn't an invitation. It was an order. And before, I would have obeyed without question. But now, after everything I had discovered, I felt only a cold calm. I can't tomorrow, I told him. I'm busy. Busy? Mom? What could you possibly be busy with? What I'm busy with is important to me, I said. There are other things that matter more to me now. There was silence on the other end of the line, a silence heavy with surprise and irritation. You're acting really weird, Mom. I don't know what's wrong with you, but you need to stop being so stubborn and sign those papers. This is for your own good. For my own good? Those words again, as if robbing me were an act of love? Bryce, I said with a voice that came out firmer than I expected, I am not signing anything, and I think we need to have a very serious conversation about a few things. About what things? He asked. His voice sounded different now, more alert, more cautious. About money that has left my account without my permission. About credit cards I didn't apply for. About utility accounts in my name at addresses where I don't live. The silence that followed was absolute, so thick I could almost feel it through the phone. I don't know what you're talking about, he finally said. His voice sounded controlled, but I could detect the panic underneath. I think you do know, I told him, and I think you need to think very carefully about what you're going to say next. Mom, you're delusional. You're confused. Maybe you need to see a doctor. There was the card I knew he would play. The card of making me seem senile, confused, incapable. I'm not confused, Bryce. I have all the papers. I have all the evidence. And I've already spoken with a lawyer. Another silence, this one longer, heavier. You talked to a lawyer? His voice was almost a whisper now, almost a threat. Yes, and he explained to me exactly what you've been doing. He explained what fraud is. He explained what is illegal. Mom, you can't be serious. I'm your son. Everything I've done has been to help you. Help me, Bryce? You robbed me for years. You used me. You lied to me. I never, he started to say, but I cut him off. Yes, you did. And you know it. The question now is what we're going to do about it. I heard his breathing on the other end of the line, heavy, ragged. I'm coming over, he said. We need to talk in person. No, I told him. You are not coming here. If you want to talk, we can do it over the phone or we can do it with lawyers present. Are you crazy? He yelled. Completely crazy. After everything I've done for you, after all the times I've come to see you, that I've worried about you, this is how you repay me? All the times you came to eat for free, you mean? All the times you needed something from me. But the times I needed you, where were you? I hung up then before he could answer, before he could manipulate me again with words. I stayed seated in my kitchen with the phone in my hand, trembling, but not from fear, from rage, from years and years of suppressed rage that was finally finding its voice. I slept better that night than I had in months, because I had finally spoken the truth. I had finally defended my territory. And although I didn't know what would come next, I knew I was no longer going to be the silent mother who allowed herself to be trampled. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. It was as if a thick fog had lifted from my mind, and now I could see everything with an almost painful sharpness. I knew what I had to do. I knew I couldn't stop now. After breakfast, I grabbed my purse and left the house. I had a mental list of all the places I needed to visit, all the loose ends I needed to tie up. If Bryce thought I was a confused, helpless old woman, he was about to find out how wrong he was. My first stop was the main bank where I kept my savings account, not the checking account where I received my paycheck, but the other one, the one I had opened 30 years ago when I still had dreams of buying a house of my own someday. I had $20,000 saved there. It wasn't much after a lifetime of work, but it was mine. I asked the manager to close the account. She asked if I was sure if there was a problem. I told her I just wanted to make some changes. She gave me the money in a cashier's check and recommended I open another account at another bank for greater security. I followed her advice. I went to a different bank, one across town, one where Bryce had never been with me. I opened a new account, an account only I knew about, an account where he could never find my money. Then I went to the utility company. I presented all the documents that Meng Chung helped me prepare. The affidavit, the copy of my ID, the proof that I had never lived at the address where the account was registered. The woman who assisted me checked everything and told me they would start an investigation, that the account would be transferred to the correct name or closed, and I would no longer be responsible. I felt as if an invisible chain had been taken off my shoulders.
My next stop was the credit bureau. I requested a full report of my history. I wanted to see everything. I wanted to know if there were more things Bryce had done behind my back. The employee gave me a thick document. I sat in the waiting room and read it page by page. There was another thing I didn't know about. A personal loan of $5,000 applied for in my name 2 years ago. A loan that had never been fully paid and was now in collections. $5,000. I felt the rage rise back up my throat like bile. I marked every fraudulent item with a highlighter. I filled out the dispute forms one by one with clear, firm handwriting. When I left that office, it was nearly 3 in the afternoon. I hadn't eaten anything since breakfast, but I wasn't hungry. I had something stronger than hunger. I had purpose. I then went to the house of my neighbor, Mrs. Bertha Washington. She was 70 years old and had lived in the building since before I did. We had been friends for decades, although we had grown distant over the last few years. I had been so focused on Bryce, so consumed with trying to maintain that relationship, that I had neglected other connections. I knocked on her door. She opened it with surprise on her face. "Ellie, what a surprise. Come in, come in." We went into her living room. She offered me coffee, and I accepted. We sat down, and she looked at me with those wise eyes that had seen a lot in life. "You look different," she said. "I don't know what it is, but there's something different about you." And then I told her everything. I told her about Bryce, about the money, about the betrayal, about everything I had discovered. I talked for almost an hour without stopping, and she listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally with an expression that mixed sadness and something that seemed like recognition. When I finished, she sighed deeply. "Ellie, I knew something wasn't right. I saw it every Friday when he came, the way he treated you like you were a service. But I didn't say anything because it wasn't my place. But I'm glad you're finally seeing the truth." She took my hand. Then her fingers were cool, but her grip was firm. "I need to ask you a favor," I said. "I need you to be my witness. I need that if Bryce comes and tries to say I'm confused, that I'm senile, you can confirm that's not true, that I'm in full possession of my faculties." She nodded without hesitation. "Of course, and more than that, if you need a place to stay, if you ever don't feel safe in your house, my door is open." Those words filled me with such deep gratitude that they almost made me cry. But I didn't cry. I had cried enough. Now it was time to act. That night, back in my house, I organized all the documents I had collected. I put them in a large folder. I made copies of everything, stored the originals in a safe place, and left the copies in the folder. If something happened to me, if Bryce tried to do anything, there would be evidence. There would be proof. I also wrote a letter detailing everything I had discovered, everything Bryce had done. I put it in a sealed envelope with instructions that it should only be opened in case of emergency. I gave it to Mrs. Bertha to hold on to. I was preparing myself like a general preparing for battle, because I knew Bryce wasn't going to let this go. I knew he would come, that he would try to manipulate me, to convince me, to make me doubt myself. But I was no longer the same woman I had been 2 weeks ago. That woman had died the night Bryce threatened me in my own kitchen. The woman I was now was different. She was stronger, clearer, more determined. On Wednesday afternoon, as I was making tea, I heard a car stop in front of my building. I looked out the window and saw Bryce's car. He got out, along with his wife. They looked determined. They were coming to confront me. I took a deep breath, put away my cup of tea, and waited. The doorbell rang once, twice, 3 times, each time more insistent. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. I stood on the threshold, blocking the entrance. "We need to talk," Bryce said. His voice was hard, with no pretense of kindness. "I'm listening," I told him. "Inside, Mom. We're not going to talk in the hallway." "We don't have anything to talk about inside. Whatever you have to say, you can say it here." His wife scoffed. "This is ridiculous, Ellie. Stop acting like we're enemies." "You're not enemies. Enemies are honest about their hostility. You're worse. You're thieves hiding behind pretty words." Bryce took a step toward me. His face was red with fury. "How dare you, after everything I've done for you?" "Everything you have done for me, Bryce? I have the records. I have the proof. I know exactly how much money you've stolen from me. I know about the fraudulent credit cards. I know about the utility account. I know about everything." He froze. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "And now," I continued, with a calmness that surprised even myself, "you have 2 options. Either you give me back everything you stole, every cent, or I go to the police and press charges for fraud." "You can't do that," his wife said. "He's your son." precisely why it hurts so much, because he is my son, because I gave him everything and he repaid me by robbing me. Bryce finally found his voice. "You owe me," he shouted. "My whole life I grew up without a father. My whole life I had to watch you work and be tired. That was your fault. You chose to have me. You chose to stay alone. I didn't ask to be born." His words landed like punches, but they no longer hurt the way they used to, because now I could see them for what they were: justifications, excuses from someone who knew he had done something unforgivable and was trying to shift the blame. "You're right," I told him. "You chose to have me, and it was the best decision of my life until it stopped being the best decision. But that doesn't give you the right to steal from me. That doesn't give you the right to exploit me. I didn't steal anything. I just took what was owed to me. Nothing was owed to you, Bryce. I gave you everything you needed when you were a child. Once you became an adult, it was no longer my obligation, and it was definitely not my obligation to give you access to my money without my knowledge." His wife grabbed his arm. "Let's go. It's not worth it. She's already lost." Lost? What an interesting choice of words. As if I was the one who was wrong. As if defending my own money and dignity was madness. They left. Then they walked down the stairs without looking back, and I closed the door, feeling strangely at peace. That night, Adam Chung called me. He told me the banks had confirmed the fraud, that the credit card debt would be canceled, and that they were investigating the unauthorized withdrawals, and that I had a solid case if I chose to press criminal charges. I thanked him and hung up. I sat in my empty living room in my house that no longer had a television or fancy furniture, and for the first time in a long time, I felt rich. Rich in something money couldn't buy, rich in dignity, in strength, in the certainty that I was doing the right thing. The days that followed that confrontation at my door were strangely silent, as if the whole world were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next.
I found myself caught in a kind of emotional limbo, where rage and pain mixed with a growing sense of liberation that I didn't know how to fully process. Bryce didn't call again. He didn't show up at my door again, and for the first time in years, I wasn't constantly waiting for his contact. I wasn't checking my phone every hour to see if there was a message from him. I wasn't inventing excuses in my mind to justify his absence or his silence. But although he wasn't physically present in my life during those days, his digital presence was impossible to ignore. Something in me led me to check his social media, something I normally wouldn't do, as it always seemed like an invasion of privacy, even for a mother. But now, I felt I had the right to know what he was doing, what he was saying, how he was presenting his life to the world while I dealt with the consequences of his actions in private. What I found took my breath away with its audacity, its absolute disconnection between reality and the image he was projecting outward. He had posted a photo the day after our confrontation. A photo of him and his wife at a fancy restaurant, smiling at the camera with glasses of wine in their hands. The caption said something about celebrating the release of toxic energy and surrounding oneself only with people who add value to life. As if I were the toxicity he needed to liberate himself from. As if my refusal to let myself be robbed further was some kind of negativity he had the wisdom to eliminate from his existence. The comments below the photo were all positive, all congratulating him for protecting his peace of mind, for setting healthy boundaries, for prioritizing his emotional well-being. I stared at the screen, feeling a mix of disbelief and disgust, because all those people supporting him had no idea that the man they were celebrating had been robbing his own mother for years. There were more posts in the following days, each one more elaborate than the last, as if Bryce were deliberately constructing a public narrative of his life that had absolutely nothing to do with the truth.
I knew a photo of him at the gym with a reflection on self-care and the importance of investing in oneself before being able to help others. Words that sounded deep and meaningful until you remembered this was the same man who had used stolen money from his mother to buy gym memberships and expensive sportswear. Another photo of him working on his computer with a comment about the sacrifice and hard work it takes to build a successful future, without mentioning that this future had been partially financed with fraudulent credit cards in my name and utility accounts I was unknowingly paying for. What impacted me most was a post he made that Friday, exactly the day he would normally have come to my house for dinner. A post where he shared an old photo of him and me when he was a child. A photo I didn't even know he had. A photo where I was holding him in my arms when he was perhaps 5 years old and we were both smiling. The text accompanying the photo was something about how sometimes the people you love the most are the ones who hurt you the most. About how he had learned that love doesn't mean tolerating abusive behavior. About how he had made the difficult decision to distance himself from a toxic family relationship for the sake of his mental health. Reading those words, I felt as if someone had punched me in the stomach. Bryce had taken our history, our real relationship, with all its complicated and painful nuances and completely inverted it, presenting himself as the victim and me as the abuser. The comments on that post were even more abundant than the previous ones. Dozens of people expressing their support, telling him how brave he was for setting those boundaries, sharing their own stories of difficult family relationships, completely validating his fabricated version of events. There were people I knew in those comments, neighbors who had known him when he lived with me, co-workers who had come to parties at my house years ago. All of them offering words of encouragement and solidarity without the slightest idea that the person he supposedly needed to protect himself from was the same woman who had worked 2 jobs for years to give him the education he now used to get his well-paying job. For several days, I watched this digital spectacle in silence, without commenting, without publicly reacting in any way, because something in me knew that this was exactly the game Bryce was playing. If I responded emotionally, I would be falling into his trap, giving him more ammunition for his narrative that I was the unstable, problematic mother he needed to distance himself from. But every new post, every new comment of support he received from people who didn't know the truth was like a small wound opening deep inside me. Not because I cared what those people thought of me specifically, but because it hurt to see how easily people believed a well-told story without questioning if there might be another side to the events. The final straw came when Bryce posted a story on his account, showing the house he and his wife had bought, showcasing the renovations they had done, the new furniture they had acquired, the perfectly designed garden, all presented as the fruit of their hard work and dedication. There was not a single mention of the fact that a significant part of all this had been paid for with money that wasn't his, with credit that had been fraudulently obtained using my personal information and utility accounts I was unknowingly paying for. What impacted me most was a post he made that Friday, exactly the day he would normally have come to my house for dinner. A post where he shared an old photo of him and me when he was a child, a photo I didn't even know he had, a photo where I was holding him in my arms when he was perhaps 5 years old and we were both smiling. The text accompanying the photo was something about how sometimes the people you love the most are the ones who hurt you the most, about how he had learned that love doesn't mean tolerating abusive behavior, about how he had made the difficult decision to distance himself from a toxic family relationship for the sake of his mental health. Reading those words, I felt as if someone had punched me in the stomach. Bryce had taken our history, our real relationship with all its complicated and painful nuances and completely inverted it, presenting himself as the victim and me as the abuser. The comments on that post were even more abundant than the previous ones. Dozens of people expressing their support, telling him how brave he was for setting those boundaries, sharing their own stories of difficult family relationships, completely validating his fabricated version of events. There were people I knew in those comments, neighbors who had known him when he lived with me, co-workers who had come to parties at my house years ago, all of them offering words of encouragement and solidarity without the slightest idea that the person he supposedly needed to protect himself from was the same woman who had worked 2 jobs for years to give him the education he now used to get his well-paying job. For several days, I watched this digital spectacle in silence, without commenting, without publicly reacting in any way, because something in me knew that this was exactly the game Bryce was playing. If I responded emotionally, I would be falling into his trap, giving him more ammunition for his narrative that I was the unstable, problematic mother he needed to distance himself from. But every new post, every new comment of support he received from people who didn't know the truth was like a small wound opening deep inside me. Not because I cared what those people thought of me specifically, but because it hurt to see how easily people believed a well-told story without questioning if there might be another side to the events. The final straw came when Bryce posted a story on his account, showing the house he and his wife had bought, showcasing the renovations they had done, the new furniture they had acquired, the perfectly designed garden, all presented as the fruit of their hard work and dedication. There was not a single mention of the fact that a significant part of all this had been paid for with money that wasn't his, with credit that had been fraudulently obtained using my personal information and utility accounts I was unknowingly paying for. What impacted me most was a post he made that Friday, exactly the day he would normally have come to my house for dinner. A post where he shared an old photo of him and me when he was a child, a photo I didn't even know he had. A photo where I was holding him in my arms when he was perhaps 5 years old and we were both smiling. The text accompanying the photo was something about how sometimes the people you love the most are the ones who hurt you the most. About how he had learned that love doesn't mean tolerating abusive behavior. About how he had made the difficult decision to distance himself from a toxic family relationship for the sake of his mental health. Reading those words, I felt as if someone had punched me in the stomach. Bryce had taken our history, our real relationship, with all its complicated and painful nuances, and completely inverted it, presenting himself as the victim and me as the abuser. The comments on that post were even more abundant than the previous ones. Dozens of people expressing their support, telling him how brave he was for setting those boundaries, sharing their own stories of difficult family relationships, completely validating his fabricated version of events. There were people I knew in those comments, neighbors who had known him when he lived with me, co-workers who had come to parties at my house years ago, all of them offering words of encouragement and solidarity without the slightest idea that the person he supposedly needed to protect himself from was the same woman who had worked 2 jobs for years to give him the education he now used to get his well-paying job. For several days, I watched this digital spectacle in silence, without commenting, without publicly reacting in any way, because something in me knew that this was exactly the game Bryce was playing. If I responded emotionally, I would be falling into his trap, giving him more ammunition for his narrative that I was the unstable, problematic mother he needed to distance himself from. But every new post, every new comment of support he received from people who didn't know the truth was like a small wound opening deep inside me. Not because I cared what those people thought of me specifically, but because it hurt to see how easily people believed a well-oiled story without questioning if there might be another side to the events. The final straw came when Bryce posted a story on his account showing the house he and his wife had bought, showcasing the renovations they had done, the new furniture they had acquired, the perfectly designed garden, all presented as the fruit of their hard work and dedication. There was not a single mention of the fact that a significant part of all this had been paid for with money that wasn't his, with credit that had been fraudulently obtained using my personal information. He displayed it all with so much pride, so much satisfaction, as if he truly believed he had earned it himself, as if he had completely forgotten, or simply didn't care, that every brick of that house was partially built on the sacrifice and theft from his own mother. I watched him live his life in those small digital windows and wondered how it was possible for someone to sleep at night knowing what they had done. How was it possible to maintain that facade of a successful, ethically correct person while simultaneously committing fraud and theft against the person who gave him life? I wondered if he ever felt guilt, if ever in the middle of one of those fancy dinners in expensive restaurants or during one of those gym workouts, he stopped for a moment and thought about his mother sitting alone in an empty house after having sold her furniture just to be able to eat because her own son had been systematically robbing her for years. But looking at his posts, seeing the ease with which he built and maintained this perfect public image, I came to understand something fundamental about Bryce, something I may have always known on some level, but never wanted to fully admit to myself. And that was that my son had developed the ability to create parallel realities in his mind.
In one reality, he could be simultaneously the abandoned son who deserved compensation and the successful man who had built everything himself. In another, he could justify theft as something he was rightfully owed while publicly presenting himself as a victim of family toxicity. It was a form of cognitive dissonance so profound that it almost seemed as if he genuinely believed his own lies, as if he had constructed such an elaborate narrative in his head that the line between truth and fiction had been completely erased. And as I watched all this from the silent distance of my empty house, something inside me hardened even more than it already was. Because seeing Bryce not only steal from me, but also steal my story, completely inverting the roles of victim and perpetrator in his public presentation of events, made me understand that there was no possible redemption here. There was no conversation I could have with him that would make him see the reality of what he had done. He had chosen his path. He had chosen the lie over the truth. He had chosen image over substance. And I needed to accept that the son I had raised and loved had never really existed in the way I believed, or had been completely replaced by this stranger who could smile for the camera while destroying his mother in private, apparently without feeling any genuine remorse. The moment came one Tuesday afternoon in a way I hadn't planned, but which, in retrospect, I realized had been inevitable from the beginning, because the truth always finds its way to the light, no matter how many layers of lies are piled up trying to keep it buried. I was in Agent Chong's office, reviewing the final case documents, where he informed me that the banks had completed their investigations and confirmed a total of $17,000 in fraudulent transactions over a period of 3 years, a sum that took my breath away. Not so much because of the number itself, but because of what it represented in terms of planning and premeditation. This hadn't been a mistake or a moment of weakness, but a systematic and deliberate operation of theft that had required constant effort and dedication on Bryce's part. The lawyer explained that with this evidence, I had more than enough to press criminal charges, but that there was also another option I might want to consider before making that final decision. That option was to send a formal demand letter to Bryce, giving him the opportunity to return the stolen money and compensate for the damages before proceeding with more severe legal action. He told me this was a courtesy many victims of family fraud offered because they understood that no matter how serious the crime, there were still family ties that complicated the situation in ways that didn't apply to cases of fraud committed by strangers. But he also warned me that this courtesy could be seen as weakness by the perpetrator and that I needed to be prepared for the possibility that Bryce would respond not with gratitude or remorse, but with more manipulation and denial. I thought about it for several minutes, sitting in the lawyer's office, looking at all the documents scattered across the desk that meticulously detailed every fraudulent transaction, every unauthorized account, every lie my son had carefully constructed for years. I realized that a part of me still harbored a small, irrational hope that if Bryce was confronted with the irrefutable evidence of what he had done, maybe something in him would awaken. Maybe he would find some vestige of conscience or remorse, or at least the basic acknowledgement that he had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. That part of me that was still his mother, despite everything, wanted to give him that opportunity to do the right thing, to correct his mistake, to show that somewhere deep inside him, the person I had raised with so much love and sacrifice still existed. But there was another part of me, stronger and clearer, that knew exactly what Bryce would do with that opportunity. And that part knew he wouldn't take it as an extension of grace, but as a confirmation that I was too weak to truly harm him, that he could continue manipulating and controlling me because at the end of the day, I would always give in, because I was his mother, and mothers always forgive, always give another chance, always choose love over justice. That part of me understood that giving him a private warning would only give him time to prepare his defense, to hide more evidence, to build an even more elaborate narrative of victimization that he could use publicly to destroy my credibility before I could act. I told Aaron Chung that I did not want to send a private letter, that I did not want to give Bryce the opportunity to respond in private, where he could continue controlling the narrative and manipulating the situation in his favor. Instead, I asked him to prepare the necessary documents to file a formal civil lawsuit that would become a public record where anyone who wanted to verify the truth could do so, instead of simply believing the version of events Bryce had been so carefully constructing on his social media. The lawyer nodded with what appeared to be a mixture of surprise and respect, because he probably didn't expect a woman my age to make such a direct and unambiguous decision. He told me he would proceed immediately with the preparation of all necessary documents and that Bryce would be officially notified within the next 72 hours. I left that office feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, something I couldn't initially identify until I realized it was power. The power of having made a decision completely by myself, without consulting anyone, without asking permission, or worrying about how it would look to others, or whether people would think I was being too hard on my own son. For the first time in decades, I had chosen to protect myself over protecting another person's feelings or reputation, even when that person was my son. And that choice, although painful, filled me with a sense of integrity I had forgotten was possible to feel. The notification reached Bryce on a Thursday morning as Aiden Chung confirmed to me by phone. Although I wasn't there to witness his initial reaction, I could perfectly imagine the moment he opened that official envelope and read the documents detailing every fraudulent transaction, every unauthorized account, every dollar he had stolen, meticulously documented with dates and bank reference numbers that made any denial impossible. I didn't have to wait long to confirm my imagination, because less than 2 hours after receiving the notification, my phone started ringing with an insistence that bordered on desperation, call after call, which I let go to voicemail without answering, because I had nothing left to say to Bryce that wasn't already contained in those legal documents. I listened to the voicemails later that night, when I finally felt emotionally prepared to do so. And it was fascinating in a disturbing way to listen to the progression of his panic through each successive message. The first one still tried to maintain some composure with that controlled voice he used when trying to seem reasonable, telling me this was a terrible misunderstanding, that we needed to talk immediately before things got more out of control. The second message already had a different tone, sharper, more urgent, where he pleaded with me to call him, that this was going to ruin his life, that I should please think about what I was doing before destroying my own son, as if I were the one destroying something instead of simply revealing the destruction he himself had caused for years. By the fifth message, Bryce was no longer trying to sound reasonable or appeal to my maternal compassion. He had completely devolved into rage and barely veiled threats, telling me I was going to regret this, that he had his own lawyers who would prove I was a senile old woman who didn't know what I was doing, that he was going to fight this with everything he had, and that in the end, I was going to look like the villain in this story. I listened to every message until the end, without allowing myself to feel anything more than a kind of clinical curiosity about how a person could transition so quickly from pleading to threatening when they realized their usual manipulation tactics no longer worked. The following days were a whirlwind of legal and emotional activity. Because Bryce didn't stand still, he began his own counterattack campaign, starting by publishing a long and elaborate statement on his social media about how he was being victimized by a terrible injustice perpetrated by a mother he supposedly loved, but who was now legally attacking him for reasons he couldn't fully comprehend. His post was carefully worded to generate maximum sympathy without mentioning any specific details of the accusations against him, painting himself as the confused and hurt son who was being dragged through a traumatic legal process by a mother who might be experiencing age-related mental health issues. The response to his post was exactly what he expected, with dozens of comments expressing shock and solidarity, telling him to keep his head up, that the truth would eventually prevail, that they were on his side no matter what. And I watched all this from a distance with a mixture of awe and revulsion at his ability to manipulate the narrative, even when faced with documented legal charges. But something had changed in me, because this time, his public theater didn't affect me in the same way it had before. This time, I knew I had something more powerful than his carefully constructed words, and that something was irrefutable legal documents that couldn't be manipulated with emotional rhetoric or appeals to sympathy. Bryce's real collapse began when his own lawyers reviewed the evidence against him and apparently told him something he didn't want to hear. His social media posts suddenly stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening in its eloquence. Dong Wu Chong informed me that Bryce's legal representatives had contacted him, asking about the possibility of reaching an out-of-court settlement, which basically confirmed that they knew he had no real defense against the evidence I had presented, and that his best option was to try to minimize the damage before this proceeded to a public trial, where all the dirty details would be revealed in public access documents. That's when the cracks in Bryce's carefully constructed life began to show. Apparently, some of his closest friends had started asking uncomfortable questions after his wife casually mentioned at a social gathering that they were dealing with a complicated family legal problem. Once people started digging a little deeper, they discovered the public lawsuit documents detailing the specific accusations of financial fraud. Mrs. Bertha told me she had heard from other neighbors that Bryce's name was being mentioned in neighborhood conversations in ways that were definitely not flattering, that the people who had once seen him as the successful, educated son now looked at him with suspicion and distrust. His wife was apparently furious, not necessarily about the moral implications of what Bryce had done, but about the damage to their social reputation. According to rumors that reached my ears through the neighborhood gossip network, there had been considerable fights in their house about how to handle the situation. Bryce tried to call me several more times during those weeks, but I maintained my absolute silence because there was nothing he could say to change the documented facts of what he had done. And my silence was apparently more devastating to him than any angry word I could have said, because it meant I had moved completely from anger to indifference, and that indifference was the final death of any power he once held over me. The final settlement was reached 3 months after I filed the lawsuit, and the terms were exactly what Admiral Chung and I had established as the minimum acceptable. Bryce had no choice but to accept when his own lawyers explained that going to trial would mean not only the complete public revelation of all the fraud details, but also the very real possibility of criminal charges that could result in jail time. he had to return the full $17,000, plus another $5,000 in compensation for damages and injuries, in addition to paying all the fees for cleaning up my credit and my attorney's fees. And all of this had to be paid within a period of 6 months with verifiable monthly payments, or the agreement would automatically be invalidated and criminal charges would proceed without further warning. But beyond the money, which honestly had never been the main point of all this, the agreement included a clause that I had insisted on adding and which Admiral Chung initially thought was unnecessary, but which for me was absolutely essential. That clause stipulated that Bryce had to issue a public statement acknowledging that he had committed financial fraud against his mother and that the accusations in my lawsuit were true and substantiated. He fought that clause more than any other part of the agreement because he knew exactly what it would mean for his carefully cultivated image to publicly admit that everything he had been saying about being a victim of a toxic mother was a lie designed to cover up his own crimes.
The statement appeared on his social media one Tuesday afternoon, was brief and clearly drafted by his lawyers to minimize the damage as much as possible, within the limits of what the agreement required. But still, the words were there in black text on a white background, admitting that he had accessed bank accounts without authorization, that he had opened credit cards using another person's information, and that he had committed serious errors in judgment that he deeply regretted. The comments under that post were wild, with people who had previously supported him unconditionally now expressing shock and disappointment, while others who had apparently suspected something all along felt validated in their doubts. I watched all that digital drama unfold with a sense of closure that had nothing to do with satisfaction or revenge, but simply with the quiet recognition that the truth had finally been spoken publicly. The first payment arrived in my account exactly on the specified date, and every subsequent payment also arrived punctually, because Bryce knew that a single missed payment would mean consequences he definitely could not afford to face. With that money, I did something he might never have expected me to do. Instead of simply replenishing my savings accounts or using it to replace the furniture I had sold, I bought a plane ticket to a place I had never been before. I had spent 62 years living for other people, for my son, for the illusion of maintaining a family relationship that only existed in my imagination. And now, for the first time in my adult life, I had the freedom and the resources to live exactly as I wanted, without having to justify my decisions to anyone. I bought a small house in a coastal town 3 hours from where I had lived all my life. A house with 2 bedrooms and a garden where I could finally plant the flowers I had always wanted, but never had time to care for when I worked 2 jobs. The house cost $200,000, which I paid for in cash using a combination of Bryce's payments and the savings I had managed to protect in my new bank account. When I signed the purchase papers, I felt something I could only describe as a rebirth, because this house was mine in a way no other place had been mine before. Bought with money that had been returned through justice, not earned through endless sacrifice. Bryce tried to contact me one last time after the final payment was made, completely fulfilling the terms of the agreement. This time I answered the phone because I knew there was nothing left he could take from me or use against me. His voice sounded different, smaller, more humble, when he asked if we could ever truly talk, if there would ever be a possibility of some kind of reconciliation. I listened to his question in silence before responding with words I had been preparing in my mind for months. I told him that the son I raised either never truly existed or died somewhere along the way, replaced by someone I didn't know and didn't want to know. I told him that while I wished him peace and growth in his life, that peace and growth would have to happen far away from me, because I had closed that door not out of hatred, but out of self-love. There was a long silence after my words, and then a sound that might have been a sob or simply ragged breathing before he hung up without saying anything else. And that was the last time I spoke to Bryce, because some doors once closed need to stay closed, not as punishment, but as protection. Now,
I live in my small house by the sea, and I spend my mornings drinking coffee in my garden, watching the flowers I planted with my own hands grow. There is a peace in this simple life that I never found in all those years of sacrifice and giving, because I finally understood that true love begins with oneself and that no relationship is worth keeping if it requires you to betray your own dignity. Sometimes I see Mrs. Bertha, who comes to visit me every few weeks, bringing gossip from the old neighborhood and news of people we used to know, and she tells me I look different now, lighter, more alive in ways that go beyond the physical. I have a routine now that is entirely mine. I wake up when my body wants to wake up, not when an alarm clock forces me to. I cook meals that I like, not thinking about someone else's preferences. I spend my afternoons reading books I always wanted to read but never had time for. And in the evenings, I sit on my small porch, listening to the distant sound of the waves and feeling a deep gratitude, not for what I have in material terms, but for what I finally understood about my own worth. This is my victory. Not in the money recovered or in Bryce's public admission, but in the fact that I recovered myself from decades of conditioning that had taught me a mother's value was measured only by how much she could give and how much she could endure. I learned that saying no is an act of self-love, that setting boundaries is not cruelty, but necessity, and that protecting your peace is not selfishness, but wisdom. And now, I live every day as a testament to those lessons learned too late, but not too late to matter. I closed that door on Bryce, not out of vengeance, but out of dignity. And that distinction makes all the difference. Because it means I won not by making him my enemy, but simply by refusing to continue being my own victim.